Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fired Up, the podcast for marketers working in early and late stage startups. I'm Morgan McClintock, the CEO of startup marketing agency Firebrand. We've launched this podcast to interview the best in the business, but I'm not going to do it alone. So please meet my co-hosts.
I'm Nicole Pytel, Firebrand's VP of Content Marketing.
And I'm Chris Ulbrich, Firebrand's Head of Media Relations.
I'm Ian Lipner, a tech PR and crisis communications veteran.
We'll drop a new episode each week, so there's plenty of fuel for your marketing fire. Get the spark you need to take your startup to a whole new level. Hello, and welcome to Fired Up, the startup marketing podcast. My name is Morgan McClintock, and I'm joined today by Nicole Pytel.
Hey, Morgan. Hey, everybody. How you doing? I am so excited about today's episode. Our guest has been everywhere from Portland to London to Cannes to everywhere in between. He is, without a doubt, the most creative person I know. So he's the perfect person to talk about creativity and marketing. So, Morgan, why don't you go ahead and introduce him?
Yes, we're joined by Doug Zanger, who is the founder of Creative Bohemian, Portland, Oregon advisory and consulting practice focused on developing strategic narratives for agencies, brands, media, editorial, and more. And just this summer, he also started the Indie Agency News, which is a platform for independent agencies. Before that, he's worked in advertising and marketing at the Martin Agency. He was an editor at Adweek and The Drum. He's worked at another agency called Stillwell Partners. And before that, spent 15 years in radio, where he won a coveted Radio Mercury Award. So, Doug, welcome to Fired Up.
It's good to be here. Good to see my friend Nicole and making a new friend in you.
Great. So today we're talking about creativity in marketing, one of our favorite topics. I'm going to start with this topical article that comes from Marketing Week. They had a piece here that says, research by Professor Karen Nelson Field, who did some research into attention on digital ads. The alarming headline that 85% of 130,000 digital ad views didn't receive more than 2.5 seconds of attention. And really, that's below this attention memory threshold. Apparently, you need 2.5 seconds or more to really go into your memory to have any impact on purchase behavior. And before that, you can get a click, but you can't really impact sales. So despite optimization to the format or the platform to kind of get over that 2.5 second threshold, the only thing that does that is more creative ads. So I wondered whether you feel like we're going to see increased emphasis on creativity after a phase of marketing where the emphasis has really been on incremental improvements in delivery.
God, I hope so. We simply get inundated all the time. And what stands out to me, and this is, I teach at Portland State University, and in teaching in the past as well, the thing I would say is people as humans, they generally pay attention to things that are interesting. And what I used to say is beautiful and interesting. And beautiful is a very subjective thing. Interesting is very subjective. But for the most part, what we see right now is so transactional, and marketers and brands that are savvy know that they can create conversations with people as opposed to transactional side of it. And this is where strong creativity can come in, because again, if you're creating something really interesting or unique, then people are going to pay attention. And you're right. I think in traditional branding, what I tell my students and what I've heard over and over again is you got 5 seconds. If you don't get them, you're gone. And you take a look at some brands that worked on branding very early on in their tenure. And I used to work for the Martin Agency, and Geico obviously is a great example of that, where they were really the pioneers of humor in that category. And now every insurance company is doing humor. It's different flavors, different success rates, shall we say. And again, that's very subjective. But it brings up a point where if people either think it's a Geico ad or know it's a Geico ad, chances are they're going to stick around for it because it's serialized and because it's different and because it's unique. And I do think that humor, very difficult to achieve, but if you can achieve it, that's a great place. Now, your company, your startup may not be in a position to use it. And if that's the case, you got to think of something very interesting to get people paying attention to you in that first 5 seconds.
Right. This research actually says 2.5 seconds. So maybe our attention is coming down. But humor, a sense of humor, timing, it demonstrates empathy, is a great way to show creativity and sort of build that rapport. But it involves risk. And I think we'll talk about this, but that sort of risk involved in anything creative, because it's new, is easy to sort of get those things diluted in order to minimize the risk. And so when you think about creativity in marketing, how would you sort of describe that?
It's kind of like porn and what they said in the US government. I know it when I see it. I mean, you can sit here and look at a million case studies, and it's not a monolith. You just don't know what is going to work. And again, going back to a class that I taught, in one of the quizzes, I had put a question in that essentially was, if a client asks, is this going to work? The correct answer is, I don't know, but we're going to work to put ourselves in a position to make it successful. In our experience, these things need to happen. If a client is not willing to trust you, then really that's on them. But if a client does trust you and it works, then that is what builds trust. It builds longevity. It builds a lot of positive things. The reality is sometimes these things won't work. And if they don't, you admit it. But you can also pull out pieces of gold from the garbage and demonstrate that you're moving forward and that there was progress. I think everybody wants perfection. And this was something that my CEO at the Martin Agency said all the time. She said progress over perfection. And it is a little cliche, but at the same time, it's relevant. It is a relevant statement. We are so hell-bent on being perfect all the time. A couple of things. Number one, it's unachievable. It's unattainable. Secondly, when you try to be perfect, you miss opportunities along the way because you're so super focused on one thing, and that gets in the way.
So you talk about that quest for perfection, and marketers absolutely are on that quest. And I think that's why there's so much talk about data-driven marketing, because it's numbers and you don't have to think about creativity. You just look at the numbers and do what works. And so, yes, data is very important, but how do you blend that data science and all the optimizations you can do with that art of creativity? How do you get the best of both worlds?
Here's the thing, Nicole. Data's been around forever. Everybody seems to think that data is some new thing. The only thing that has changed is the mechanism. Digital has changed everything. Again, going back to this cliche, digital has changed everything. And in the earlier days of advertising, data still existed. It was qualitative, it was quantitative. It was harder to get, but I would argue that because there was some limitations to it, it was easier to find a clearer path to something potentially being successful. Because now we're so enamored with KPIs and getting so granular with it. Again, we lose track of the bigger picture, which is momentum, growth. And for a startup, you want momentum. You want growth. If you are a Series A or B company and you just got your rounds of funding, if you're Series A or Series B, congratulations. You're now a brand, whether you like it or not. You have to start acting like a brand. That takes discipline. That takes getting the right people there. Marketing and advertising is one piece of it, advertising being one piece of it. But you have to wake up one morning with that $15 million check in your hand and say, well, I'm a brand now. Here we go.
For folks that say, hey, we're creative, we have a brand, it's creative, How do you actually know that? Is there a way to measure it aside? Is it just momentum, or how do you take an honest look at yourself and say, hey, we are?
This is where data can be very handy. You will see where the trend lines are going. You may be, a startup that, all of a sudden you're getting a huge user base, and that's a big thing. So it's like, okay, we're gonna focus on this. We're not going to ignore the other stuff going on, but let's put a little more weight in here. Let's see if we can get daily users up or whatever. Or if you're seeing inbounds on something, again, you have to look specifically at where some of the trend lines are. Now, that doesn't necessarily make you a brand. A brand, those become tactical in a way. So what you need to be thinking about is spending the time and engaging the right people. And I would argue that a great resource is an agency, because number one, they will have an outside perspective. They will be able to tell you what is tracking, what your story is, what your narrative is. If you are simply presenting yourself as a utility, you've obviously lost the plot. Let's think about data storage, for example. Why did Dropbox do so well? They had a brand. There's a million different ways that you can store data, but there was a stretch, and I can't remember exactly. It was probably, mid-2010s, where it was just about Dropbox. Zoom is ostensibly a utility, but man, did they create a brand, and look what they've done with it. So there are real world examples of utilities, and one could argue that if you're a startup, you're thinking, if you're software as a service or whatever, that in lay terms is a utility. How do you make that come to life? What is your narrative on that? What is the story behind it? And it's not about, well, we do X, Y, and Z. It's about, especially in the B2B space, how do you solve their problems? How do you make them feel good about themselves because you've given them more than just a tool? You've given something to them that's transformative.
Any of these brand activations involve taking some kind of risk. It hasn't been done before because it's novel. By definition, that is creativity. It can draw on the past. You talked about, hey, look, we can tell you that this is how to set it up for success, but we haven't done it before. And in order to sort of get that over the line, you need to build that trust. But, what is the best way? You come up with an idea. Everyone in the room thinks it's great. As more people get involved, it can get diluted. It has to get through various gatekeepers. How do you protect that? Those ideas are so fragile at the beginning. How do you protect it?
Yeah, so a couple of things there. Number one, let's go back to that word you said, risk. You're a startup. You've already taken the risk. So you have an analog that exists already. You know what it's like. This is the next natural progression. I would say when an idea starts, I call this making a camel. A camel is a horse by committee.
Right.
And so I've said this in meetings before. I said, well, we have a choice. We can either just have a beautiful horse or we can have a camel. What does that mean? Well, you're taking this idea and morphing it. This is the job of either the internal marketing teams or the agency to stand firm. Now, going back to risk, for the startup, for the brand, there is a risk involved. There's also a huge risk for the agency. But the agency is calculating, this is all calculating risk. And the agency is calculating its risk with the best information that they have, combined with their experience and their track record and being able to point to success in certain areas. So logic sometimes is a good thing in that respect, because if you do have those points, then you can articulate them and demonstrate. Now, again, there's no guarantee that anything ever is going to work. There is no guarantee. But all you're doing is trying to set yourself up to be in a position to be successful.
I also think that there's a big risk in doing nothing. You're taking a risk through inaction that your competitor is actually going to go out there and do it. How are you going to feel if they do this, one sort of projection exercise. How would you feel if your competitor did this and you didn't?
Right.
You're taking a risk in passing up this opportunity.
Yeah, if you do nothing, again, going back to the Dropbox example, there were tens of hundreds probably of these platforms, right?
Yeah.
But Dropbox made people feel safe. They made them feel comfortable. They became a brand that could be trusted. WeTransfer is another one where it's like, oh, yeah, okay, cool. And you can go the route of working hard to try to establish yourself. And again, find a position that works and then work creatively around it to build the narrative of what it is. And it takes discipline. It's not just coming up with a pithy idea. And the other thing is you need a lot of ideas. I know of agencies that they call it papering the wall or filling the wall, depending on the agency. When I was at the Martin Agency, when I would go back to Richmond to see the agency, we'd be working on something for one of our clients, and the wall would be filled with ideas in various degrees of being formed up, but pretty far along. And agencies are great at that. My CEO, Kristen Cavallo at the time, fantastic leader, she said this, and she used to say this to clients, which I loved. She said, you think of your advertising 10% of the time, we think about it 100% of the time. So you can, by the transitive property, say the same thing as it relates to marketing in general. Congratulations, Series A and Series B. Now go do your thing. We're going to work hard on this part. We're going to think about this part 100% of the time. And you might think about it 10, 20% of the time, but we got you.
You talk a little bit about that creative process, because you have to come up with the idea in the first place. So is creativity something that, for lack of a better word, that you can operationalize? Like, how do you come up with those ideas in the first place?
Yeah. So the book I will encourage both of you and everyone to read is Hey Whipple, Squeeze This by Luke Sullivan. Get the most recent edition of it. It takes you through the creative process. Operationalizing it means that you are creating systems and structures to set up your teams to create. Usually what happens is the creative brief is the document that matters the most in this process. The creatives have nothing to do with it. It's the account people, the strategy people, the analysts. They go in, work with the client, and that's where the brief comes into play. It has to be simple. It has to be actionable. It has to be clear. You can't have mushy briefs. If you're working in vagaries and you're working in metaphors and not really clarity, then that's a bad brief and you will fail. Now the creatives, their job and their role is to make all of that come to life. And the process is messy. It is very, very messy. Creativity will strike at the strangest moments. I'll give you a very specific example. I'm executive director of Think Northwest, which is a regional marketing body in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, British Columbia, and Alaska. I've been thinking about, we need a video, and we need a promotional video, blah, blah, blah. So I've been thinking about the idea, and I have stuff written down. And as I was driving in my car the other day, I was like, oh, this is the way we're going to do this. And that's when it hit, because your subconscious works the problem whether you know it or not. And it will pop up in weird places. And Nicole saw that with me. And she's seen that with me before, where it randomly pops up, or you'll be in a session with somebody or just having a conversation with somebody, and then all of a sudden 4 more ideas form. It just happens. But after that happens, then you have to go in and determine which is the best idea and how do you really refine it so that it becomes powerful.
You need a high volume of ideas, because then the best ones sort of shine. And I wonder, now that we're sort of in this remote work, remote first, or return to office environment, do you have a perspective on whether that impacts the level of creativity? Sometimes when you're in the room, the sort of pressure, the creative pressure in that room helps release a lot of good ideas. Other times it absolutely kills it.
Yeah, there is the idea of constraint. So the brief helps address that. So you have the constraint. I would say that in my experience and in my observation, those ideas don't necessarily come to fruition in the office. It may gestate it, but I know of creative directors that have been trying to work a problem and then they went hiking in the Columbia River Gorge and it hit them. So I think that creativity is tailor-made for a hybrid approach. And a lot of those ideas don't necessarily come from the office. They might start there, but sometimes they don't end there. I mean, and that's a generalization. Obviously, when if you're sitting in a room and you're really working the problem and brainstorming, you may come up with it. But again, that subconscious piece of it works the problem more than people realize.
Absolutely, for sure. I think some of my best ideas come when I'm just running and trying not to think about work, and it just happens. So what do you say to the startup marketer who's listening to this and says, you know what, being creative is great. I totally agree with you, but we don't have time to paper the wall, or we don't have the resources, or we're so strapped for time and money that we just have to get things out the door. How do you combat that?
Well, there's a misperception that agencies are hired. They work with the client, they get the brief, and then they go away, smoke cigars, have 9 martini lunches, and then come back and here, ta-da. It's not Mad Men at all. Agencies have adapted to the way the world works right now, and especially independent agencies. And again, I'm not trying to put my stall out here, but independent agencies tend to work leaner. They tend to work like startups. They absolutely do. So I think there is this misperception that an agency will stop the process, when in point of fact, the goal of an agency and the role of an agency is to help a client solve their business problems. That's the way it's always been. That's the way it is. That's the way it will be in the future. So the new era of agency is tailor-made for that. Now, that's a perceptual thing that agencies need to continually combat. But to the marketer that's saying we don't have time for that, well, you better make the time. Because to Morgan's point earlier, if you're not going to make the time, your competitor will. Then you're going to be stuck holding the bag.
So I totally agree with that. You need to make sure that you make the time to have the brilliant idea. There is always for startups an impetus to just be executing because, you've got to have all those at-bats. But a little bit of creativity in there definitely increases the chances of success, and you've got to take that risk. When you think about sort of opportunity like marketers, what are some of the things that they are missing when it comes to being creative? Because I think that, you think about creativity and you're thinking about this huge campaign idea and maybe it's some out-of-home advertising or what have you. But there are opportunities to be creative in small ways. Tweaking this blog post headline, adding this nice little image to the post. Small creativity, I think, is helps keep that flex that muscle and build some confidence for the big things.
No, I agree. And I think you have to look at it both at a macro and a micro level. So on the macro level, my advice would be to look at some of the award-winning advertising that's been out there over the many, many decades and sit with it. Don't try to find where the KPIs are. Don't try to, just take it for what it is. That it's interesting work, that it could be very good work. Going back to Apple 1984, all of the Apple Mac versus PC, Mac versus PC work. Nike is a complete library of excellence and brilliance. But I think historically and on a macro level, that puts your mind in a space where you acknowledge that, wow, this is something really, really good. And for the most part, that stuff worked in building these brands. And when you start getting down into a more micro level, you're right. Your headlines should be better. I use stock photography because I can't afford anything else. But, it's like, try to be bespoke. There's a good British word for you, about everything. And I think that in those smaller moments, It's simply moving it forward. There's not going to be one big ta-da moment in any of this. It's a process. It takes time. So take headlines, for example, Morgan. Your headlines may be dry, and you may experiment with something that's a little more human or funny or provocative. And then all of a sudden, when you start seeing the traffic go up, you start seeing the inbounds, you start seeing that stuff, then you realize, oh, okay, this is probably how we should adjust our tone. Tone is a big thing. Because if you ingest a lot of B2B content, let's just take blog content, for example. If you ingested all of that in an AI and asked it, what makes any of this different? My guess is probably not a lot. When I was an editor at Adweek, and it's the same now with Indie Agency News, when I get pitched things, I always tell people, this is a word problem. I'm essentially taking all of the stuff out of it that I think is too marketing speaky, too dull, too dry. I'm trying to find what actually matters in this. And I may end up with a sentence or two that really is the nub of it. And if I can't find it, then thank you, I respectfully pass. So same deal. But the tone piece of it is really, really, really important. You have to ask yourself, does our tone reflect who we really are? And who is important, not the what. The what is the utility behind it. The who is what our belief systems are. And if that means that, your founder is funny, then it should reflect that. If your founder is serious, well, fine, but find a way to make it interesting. So finding the tone sets the tone.
Even with the tone, even if you have a funny founder, sometimes the creative juices, they're just not flowing, no matter how many runs you go on. It's not happening. So what do you do when you're, staring at that blank Google Doc or something like that? How do you get yourself unstuck?
I go for a walk. I take a drive. I go play soccer. I do anything but work. That's it. It's the law of diminishing returns. The more you sit there and stare at it, the less progress you will make. You have to step away from it. You absolutely have to step away from it. Morgan, you brought up things move fast, and Nicole, you brought up things move fast. Yeah, you get that. But if you put something out there that doesn't do anything, it's wasted time and a wasted exercise. So you just have to step away from it. That's the simplest thing. And I don't mean to be reductive about it, but that's the first step. The rest of it, you have to figure out from there. But if you start with that, that's helpful.
Sometimes when doing copywriting, we've used AI to sort of solve the blank page problem, right? Get a rough,
Sure.
Get the process started, take the first step. There's a lot about AI impacting marketing, coming down to sort of a very lowest common denominator type of content. Do you think that AI will kill creativity, or will it actually spark it because it solves that first sort of blank page problem?
It's a great question. It becomes that existential thing about writers. And I think that's really where it comes in. You could argue designers too, with Midjourney and all of that. But I would also argue that if everybody's doing it and using it, it's all going to start looking, sounding, feeling the same, right? Because an AI is only as good as the input, the data that's in it. And I think that you'll start seeing a sea of sameness in it. And I did use Midjourney for some images for some stuff for Think Northwest. And I was realizing that maybe my prompts weren't exactly right, but they weren't awful. And there was enough variety, but I was still getting similar takes on things. And I just started looking at it and I thought, it's not for me. Now, to take AI, let's use words, for example. Yeah, it helps in getting you to a starting point. It absolutely does. But you can pretty much tell when something is machine generated or human generated. Now, it's okay to have machine learning and machine generation of things to get started, but the human aspect of it needs to always be there.
So you're not worried that these tools are going to diminish people's creativity by...
No, I didn't say that.
You're not... Well, right, making us lazy, because it's easy to be lazy and just do the lazy version of it, right? Or it could save the time to doing the basic stuff in order to free up extra thinking time to be more creative.
That's the argument. Mm-hmm. That's the argument, but it's far too early to tell. There's been, using air quotes here, game-changing technology since the beginning of time.
Right.
And I do think AI is slightly different in a lot of ways, not slightly, but very different in a lot of ways. But again, it comes down to the end user. If they're all doing the same thing and not progressing it forward, that's a problem. You're right. You can take some of those rote tasks and automate that. But ultimately, if you don't progress past that, then you're not necessarily being that creative.
Do you think AI will make us appreciate creativity more? Because I know now, to your point, you can spot when a machine has written it. If I read one more article that starts with, in today's ever-growing landscape, blah, 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 it just makes me crave something that's better. Do you think people will start to really notice when something is creative and it stands out?
I mean, the algorithms will decide that too, right? My hope is yes. I don't have an answer for it, but my hope is yeah. And I think we will get to a point where, let's just take search, for example. If everybody is using the same techniques and everything starts sounding the same, Google rewards quality content. And there will come a point where I believe that Google will maybe downgrade content that looks like it was made by an AI, unless it's their AI, of course. But I could see that happening. That's a scenario that's plausible. Does it help with SEO? Probably. But over time, if you end up showing up on page 9 now because you're doing the same thing, then what's the point?
So you often go to Cannes Lions.
It's been a while, but yes.
I wondered what lessons, you talked about, hey, you got to study in order to sort of come up with, study the history of great advertising to be able to see the archetypes of what works and see if that can work for you. When you've been, what do you see there that maybe that the big guys are doing that maybe smaller companies could borrow?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know if I have a definitive pithy answer for it. I would say that you have to go a little bit deeper when you go to Cannes. And the beauty of going there is that you can talk to the people that were responsible for the work. You can see a little bit more depth in, they have a big hall that has all this, stuff, all this creative stuff in there. And it's fascinating. It's like learning how the machine works. And my biggest takeaway is less about the tactical side of this is great creativity, and it's more about the human side of people being excited about creativity and being appreciative of it. So in a way, it becomes what some people would argue is an art form when it's done well. And there's truth to that. It's a commercial endeavor, but it can be artistic. So I would say that the personal side of it and getting into people's heads is the main thing there, and going a little bit deeper.
We're going to dig a little bit deeper, maybe call it crystal ball time. We're starting to gather up some predictions for 2024. Would you like to throw your hat into the ring with a prediction or two?
Oh boy. I predict that my children will get older. No. I will say, because most of my life is in the agency side, and especially on the independent agency side, that we will start, number one, we'll start seeing a lot more independent agencies popping up in the next year. It's similar to 2008 and 2009 when there was a talent shakeout. That's happening now at the bigger agencies and the holding companies. So I think you're going to see a lot more independent agencies pop up. I also think that the agency community will improve its ability to tell its story. That's what I think.
Do you think big brands are becoming more comfortable with working with smaller agencies?
Yeah, because the agency of record has been eroding. So for those who don't know, agency of record, that's when a big brand comes in, Says, you are agency, you're going to do everything. Now, when you become an AOR, you may work with other agencies. So an example of that is Wieden & Kennedy and Nike. Wieden & Kennedy doesn't do everything. They do basically the big brand work, but other agencies get these assignments. So I think that big brands are more comfortable with it because they may carve out a piece of the business. I'll give you an example. I do voiceover work. I mean, listen, I know I sound like a radio guy, but but I was cast in an ad for Nike Running years ago, and it was by a small agency up in Seattle. It wasn't Wieden & Kennedy. They were responsible for Nike Running at the time. So I do think that in a more project-based environment, that these big brands, they're seeking out these types of agencies because they do want fresh thinking.
Brilliant. So our next section is called Smart People, Dumb Questions. And these are more personal questions. And in this section, I literally pull the questions out of a bag, which I have.
Oh, I like this. That's a very nice bag, by the way.
Especially for this. Oh, if you could learn one skill instantly, what would it be?
To fly an airplane.
Oh, nice.
To fly a jet.
Fly yourself to Cannes.
Right.
We just had the Blue Angels flying over San Francisco, and honestly, those guys. Oh, what is your most irrational superstition?
Well, I'm half Italian, so there's a long list. My most irrational superstition is that if I watch too much of my favorite sports teams, so I'm an Arsenal supporter. So if I watch, I'll use Arsenal. So if I watch too much of an Arsenal match, I believe that I will force them to either draw or lose.
I'm a Spurs supporter, so please keep watching.
Yep.
Do you cheat at board games?
Yeah. Yeah, of course I do. Especially if it's my kids. Hey, look.
You know, I no longer play board games with my wife, especially Monopoly, because she's too competitive and she hides the money underneath the board. And it doesn't end. Last one. What's the most unexpected turn your life has taken?
Ooh. I think it was the birth of our first child and fully understanding what unconditional love meant.
Totally changes your life. Makes everyone a better person.
But I would also say the same thing about when we brought our dog home. And Nicole has seen my dog. She's a doll.
Yeah. She's beautiful.
So our next section is called Fired Up 5. So take it away, Nicole.
All right. So these are quick questions, quick answers. First things first, what would you do if you were not in advertising?
I'd be a teacher, which I do part-time, but I would do it full-time.
What is the best career advice you have ever been given?
Comes from radio, but it applies everywhere. Always care about what you put on the air. This was my mentor, Gordon Miller. He said, even if it's just a voice track and a music track, make it the best read and the best thing and the best music you can find.
What is the tool that you cannot do your job without?
Probably this microphone. My Rode broadcast microphone. There you go. There's a little plug for you, Rode.
So what hot trend have you got your eye on right now?
I am 54 years old. I do not track trends.
All right. And finally, I think I might know the answer to this question. AI, overhyped or underused?
Both.
I knew he was going to say that.
Good answer.
Yep.
Hedge it. Doug Zanger is the founder of Creative Bohemian. Thanks for coming on Fired Up. It really enjoyed talking to you. If people want to get in touch with you, where should they go?
LinkedIn. Just start at LinkedIn. I'm not going to give you a bunch of stuff, but I would encourage you to go to indieagency.news to see what we got cooking over there.
Indieagency.news. Wonderful. Okay, Doug, thanks for your time today. Really enjoyed it. And we look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks so much. Up the arsenal.
Well, that about wraps it up for today. But before we close, we did want to offer all of our Fired Up friends a chance to grab a mega pack of all of our ebooks and guides. That's our guide to content marketing. That's our startup guide to paid media using Google Ads. It's our guide to attribution. You can get all of those, over 100 pages of goodness, at firebrand.marketing/fired up freebies. That's freebies with an S. And we hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, Please give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts, or drop us a note at firebrand.marketing. And as ever, the details of how to get in touch with our guest today can be found in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and until next week, get out there and crush your marketing goals.